July 7th, 1968, 7:47 in the morning. Harlem Hospital in room 412. Frank Lucas stood beside the hospital bed, watching the man who'd taught him everything struggle to breathe. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 62 years old, the undisputed boss of Harlem for over 3 decades, was dying. Each breath came slower than the last. The heart monitor beeped irregularly. A nurse had told Frank 20 minutes earlier, it could be any moment now. Frank was 38 years old. He'd spent exactly 15 years and 2 months working for Bumpy Johnson. 15 years as a driver, a bodyguard, a shadow. 15 years watching, learning, staying silent. And in all that time, Bumpy had never once told Frank what to do after he was gone. Outside that hospital room, 5 Italian crime families were waiting. Not literally. They weren't standing in the hallway, but they were waiting. They'd already started carving up Bumpy's territory in their minds. Frank knew because they'd each sent someone to check on Bumpy's condition over the past week. What they really wanted to know was, who's going to control Harlem when Bumpy dies? And nobody, not one of them, thought it would be Frank Lucas. But in the next 90 seconds, Bumpy Johnson would tell Frank Lucas something that nobody else in that hospital, nobody in Harlem, and nobody in the entire American underworld knew. It wasn't advice. It wasn't a pep talk. It was a complete blueprint for building the biggest drug empire in American history. A blueprint that would make Frank Lucas richer than every Italian mob boss in New York combined. What Frank heard in that hospital room didn't just change his life. It changed the entire structure of organized crime in America. And it started with 7 words Frank never expected to hear. This is that story. But before we get into what Bumpy said in those final moments, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right now. The story you're about to hear is one of the most incredible transformations in criminal history, and there are a lot more untold stories coming on this channel. And I really want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Now let's go back to 1953 because you need to understand who Frank Lucas was before that hospital room to appreciate what happened after. October 12th, 1953. Frank Lucas walked into Harlem with a $200 in his pocket and a murder charge waiting for him back in North Carolina. He was 23 years old. He'd killed a man, a Ku Klux Klan member who'd assaulted Frank's cousin. And he knew if he stayed in Greensboro, he'd either end up dead or in prison for life. So Frank took a Greyhound bus north and got off at 125th Street with no plan, no connections, and no idea what he was going to do. For 6 months, Frank did what everyone did. He ran numbers. He bussed tables at Small's Paradise nightclub. He made $40 a week and slept on his cousin's couch. He was nobody, just another young black man trying to survive in Harlem. Then one night in April 1954, Frank was bussing tables at Small's when Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked in. Frank had heard the name. Everyone in Harlem knew Bumpy Johnson. He'd been running numbers, policy games, and protection rackets since the 1930s. He'd worked with Lucky Luciano, fought with Dutch Schultz, and outlasted every gangster who tried to take him down. By 1954, Bumpy was 48 years old and controlled more of Harlem than any boss before him. When Bumpy Johnson walked into a room, the entire room stopped. But here's what Frank noticed that night. Bumpy didn't demand attention. He just had it. He walked to his usual table, number 7, in the back corner where he could see both entrances, and sat down alone. No entourage, no armed guards making a scene. Just Bumpy in a tailored dark suit, reading the Amsterdam News and eating fried chicken. Frank was clearing the table next to Bumpy's when he heard, "You work hard." Frank turned. Bumpy was looking at him with those calm, calculating eyes. "Yes, sir," Frank said. "You run numbers for Junie Bird on 116th? "Yes, sir." Bumpy nodded. "Come see me tomorrow. 10 a.m. I'm at the Rhythm Club." Then he went back to his newspaper like the conversation had never happened. Frank showed up at 9:45 the next morning. By noon, he was Bumpy Johnson's driver. For the next 15 years, Frank Lucas didn't just work for Bumpy Johnson. He studied him. And Bumpy led him. That was the thing about Bumpy. He didn't talk much, but he taught constantly. Through observation. Through example, Frank drove Bumpy to meetings with Italian mob bosses in Little Italy. He stood outside while Bumpy negotiated disputes between numbers runners on Lenox Avenue. He watched Bumpy settle beefs without ever raising his voice, turn enemies into allies without firing a shot, and build respect through intelligence instead of violence. But here's what Frank learned most importantly. Bumpy never rushed. Every move Bumpy made was calculated 3 steps ahead. When a young hothead named Marcus Smooth Henderson tried to take over a corner on 147th Street in 1959, everyone expected Bumpy to have him killed. Instead, Bumpy invited Smooth to lunch at Wells' restaurant, listened to his ambitions for 2 hours, and then offered him a partnership on a different block entirely. Within 6 months, Smooth was one of Bumpy's most loyal operators. "You can kill a man in 5 seconds," Bumpy told Frank one afternoon in 1962. They were driving back from a meeting in Queens. "But you can't unkill him. Every time you take someone out, you create 10 new problems. Their crew wants revenge, their family wants justice. The cops start paying attention. But if you can turn an enemy into an ally, now you've got double the strength and half the problems." Frank wrote that down in a notebook he kept in Bumpy's Cadillac. He had 17 notebooks by 1968 filled with lessons Bumpy had taught him just by being himself. But there was one thing Bumpy never talked about: succession. Who would take over when Bumpy was gone? Frank asked once in 1960. Bumpy just smiled and said, "That's not your concern." And Frank understood. He was the driver, the bodyguard, the employee, not the heir. By July 1968, Frank Lucas had saved $100,000 from his 15 years working for Bumpy. That was exactly what Bumpy had taught him to do. Save everything, stay patient, think long-term. But Frank also knew that 100,000 and no respect meant nothing in Harlem. When Bumpy died, Frank would be just another former employee, scrambling for survival like everyone else. At least that's what Frank thought. Sunday, June 30th, 1968, 8:47 p.m., Wells Restaurant, 132nd and 7th Avenue. Bumpy Johnson collapsed between the dessert and coffee. Frank was standing near the entrance, watching the room like he always did. Bumpy was at his usual table with the 3 other operators, discussing a shipment problem from Philadelphia. Then Bumpy's face went pale. His left hand grabbed his chest. And Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd survived 30 years of Harlem's underworld, fell forward onto the table. Frank had him in the Cadillac within 90 seconds. Harlem Hospital was 6 blocks away. Frank ran every red light. Bumpy was unconscious in the back seat, barely breathing. Frank carried him through the emergency room doors at 8:54 p.m., and doctors immediately rushed Bumpy into surgery. Massive heart attack, severe damage. The doctor told Frank at midnight he might have a week, maybe less. For the next 7 days, Frank Lucas lived in that hospital. He slept in the waiting room. He ate vending machine sandwiches. He let almost nobody in to see Bumpy, just a few of Bumpy's oldest associates, and even then only for 5 minutes each. But word spread fast. By Monday morning, everyone in Harlem knew Bumpy Johnson was dying, and everyone started positioning for what came next. July 1st, Monday afternoon. A soldier from the Genovese crime family showed up at the hospital. His name was Tony Rizzo. He told Frank he was there to pay respects, but what he really did was ask questions. How's Bumpy's territory being managed? Who's handling the policy games on 147th? Are his operators still collecting? Frank answered politely, gave nothing away, and walked Tony Rizzo to the elevator. July 2nd, Tuesday morning. 2 guys from the Lakis family, same thing, paying respects, asking questions about territory, operators, vulnerabilities. July 3rd, July 4th, July 5th. Different families, different crews, same questions. By July 6th, Frank had counted visits from 5 separate Italian operations, 3 independent Harlem crews, and a dozen former Bumpy associates, all trying to figure out the same thing. Who's weak? Who's vulnerable? What can we take? And not one of them asked Frank Lucas what he was going to do. Because nobody saw Frank as a player, just Bumpy's driver. Loyal? Sure. Tough? Probably. But not a strategist. Not a boss. That was fine with Frank. Let them think that. He had $100,000 saved and zero plan for what to do with it. If Bumpy died without telling Frank how to move forward, Frank would probably do what the others expected. Take his money, leave Harlem, start over somewhere else. Maybe Atlanta, maybe Detroit. But then July 7th happened. Sunday morning, July 7th, 1968, 7 a.m. Frank walked into Harlem Hospital the way he had every morning that week. He bought coffee from the machine in the lobby, 50 cents, black, 2 sugars, and took the elevator to the 4th floor. The overnight nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd gotten used to seeing Frank, stopped him before he reached room 412. "He's been asking for you," she said. "He woke up about 30 minutes ago. He's lucid." Frank felt something tighten in his chest. For 6 days, Bumpy had been unconscious or barely aware. But lucid? That changed everything. Frank walked into room 412 at 7:03 a.m. The morning light came through the window in pale gray streaks. Bumpy was awake, propped up slightly in the hospital bed. His eyes were clear. He looked at Frank and said, "They all came to see you this week, didn't they?" Frank nodded. "5 families, a few independents. They asked about territory?" "Every single one." Bumpy smiled slightly, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who'd predicted exactly what would happen and was disappointed to be proven right. "And they didn't ask what you were going to do?" "No," Frank said. "Of course not," Bumpy said quietly. "They don't think you're smart enough." Frank started to respond, but Bumpy raised one hand, just slightly, just enough to say, "Wait." Then Bumpy said something Frank never expected to hear. "I taught you everything except one thing, Frank, and that's the thing you actually need." Frank pulled a chair closer to the bed. Bumpy's voice was weak, but his mind was sharp. "When I started in this business," Bumpy said, "the Italians controlled everything. Luciano, Genovese, Costello, they decided who operated where, who paid what, who lived and who died. And us, black operators in Harlem, we paid them tribute. We worked their corners. We took their scraps and said thank you." Frank knew this history, everyone did, but he'd never heard Bumpy talk about it like this. "I fought them for 30 years, Frank, and you know what I learned? You can't beat them at their game. They own the supply. The heroin comes through Sicily, through Marseille, through their connections in Europe. By the time it gets to Harlem, they've marked it up 4 times. We buy it from them, cut it down to nothing, and sell it on their streets for their prices. They control everything because they control the source." Bumpy paused to catch his breath. Frank waited. "But the world is changing, Frank. There's a war in Vietnam. Tens of thousands of American soldiers stationed in Southeast Asia. And right next door to Vietnam, in Laos and Burma and Thailand, there's something called the Golden Triangle. That's where most of the world's opium is grown. Raw opium, Frank. Uncut. Pure." Frank's mind started racing. "You go to the source," Bumpy said, his voice getting stronger now, more focused. "You eliminate the middleman. You go directly to the producers in Southeast Asia. You bring the heroin straight to Harlem. No Sicilian suppliers, no Marseille connections, no Italian markup. You sell it pure or close to pure for half their price. You'll put them out of business in 6 months." Frank felt like the entire room had shifted. This wasn't advice. This was revolution. "They'll never see it coming," Bumpy continued, "because they don't think you're smart enough to do it. They think you're just my driver. And that's your advantage, Frank. They're going to ignore you until it's too late." Bumpy reached under his pillow and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His hand trembled slightly as he handed it to Frank. "I've been watching the world change for 5 years now. I knew this war would create opportunities. I made some connections. These are names, addresses, protocols for contact. One man in particular, his name is at the top. He's expecting someone to reach out eventually. Not me. I'm too old, too known. But someone." Frank unfolded the paper. 4 names, 3 addresses in Bangkok, 1 in Saigon, and detailed notes in Bumpy's handwriting about how to make initial contact. "This is not the advice I'd give you if you wanted to be me," Bumpy said. "If you want to control Harlem the way I controlled Harlem, this won't work. But if you want to build something bigger than Harlem, something those Italian families can't touch, this is how you do it. Frank stared at the paper. His hands were shaking. You've got 100,000 saved, Bumpy said. I know because I taught you to save. That's enough to make the first trip, meet the connections, and bring back your first shipment. After that, it's just execution. You brand it. You keep it pure. You undercut their prices. And you stay quiet, Frank. Don't try to be the king of Harlem. That's the old way. The old way is dying with me. At 8:15 a.m., Bumpy's breathing changed. It became shallower, more irregular. Frank stood up, still holding the paper. He wanted to say something, thank you, or I won't let you down, or something meaningful, but the words wouldn't come. Bumpy looked at him one more time. Don't try to be king of Harlem, Frank, he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. Be the king of the world. At 8:23 a.m., the heart monitor flatlined. Nurse Patricia rushed in with 2 doctors. They tried to resuscitate him for 4 minutes. But at 8:27 a.m., they called it. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 62 years old, the smartest, most strategic operator Harlem had ever known, was dead. Frank Lucas stood in that hospital room for another 10 minutes, alone with Bumpy's body. The piece of paper was folded in his hand. He read it 3 more times, memorizing every word. Then he put it in his inside jacket pocket, buttoned his suit, and walked out of room 412. The waiting room was full, 20 people, maybe more. Old associates of Bumpy's, operators who'd worked for him, a few Italian soldiers paying respects. They all looked at Frank as he walked past. They saw what they expected to see, a loyal employee devastated by his boss's death, probably wondering what he'd do next. What they didn't see was the blueprint in Frank's pocket, or the plan already forming in his mind. Frank got in Bumpy's Cadillac, his Cadillac now, he supposed, and drove to his apartment in Queens. He sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours, reading that paper over and over. 4 names, 3 addresses. One sentence that kept echoing in his mind, be the king of the world. Wednesday, July 10th, 1968, St. John's Cemetery, Queens, New York. Over 2,000 people came to Bumpy Johnson's funeral, every major operator in Harlem, representatives from all 5 Italian families, legitimate businessmen who'd known Bumpy for decades, and hundreds of regular Harlem residents who'd respected Bumpy as the man who kept order in their neighborhood. Frank Lucas stood in the back of the crowd, near a tree about 50 yards from the burial site. He wore a dark suit and sunglasses. He didn't speak to anyone. He watched. He watched the Italian representatives assess who looked strong and who looked weak among Bumpy's former associates. He watched 3 different Harlem crews position themselves near each other, subtle jockeying for status now that Bumpy wasn't there to keep everyone in line. He watched Bumpy's old lieutenants shake hands with Italian soldiers, probably already making deals to buy heroin at the Italians' prices, to operate on Italian terms. And nobody approached Frank Lucas. Not one person asked him what his plans were. They saw him as exactly what he'd been for 15 years, Bumpy's driver. Loyal, sure. Sad, probably, but not relevant to what came next. That was exactly what Frank needed. Monday, July 15th, 1968, 6:30 a.m. JFK Airport, Pan Am Flight 802 to Bangkok. Frank Lucas boarded the plane with 1 suitcase, 100,000 in cash hidden in a false bottom, and Bumpy's paper folded in his wallet. The flight took 28 hours with stops in Los Angeles, Tokyo, and Manila. Frank didn't sleep. He read the paper 17 times. He memorized every detail. He rehearsed the contact protocols Bumpy had written down. On August 4th, 1968, Frank Lucas sat across from a man named Chen Wei in a restaurant in Bangkok's Chinatown district. Chen Wei was 54 years old, a facilitator between opium producers in the Golden Triangle and international buyers. Bumpy had met him once in 1966 through a military contact. Now Frank was sitting at Chen Wei's table, explaining exactly what he wanted. I need direct access to the producers, Frank said. No middlemen. I'm paying cash, I'm buying volume, and I'm looking for long-term partnership. Chen Wei studied Frank for a long moment. Then he asked the obvious question, why should they trust you? Frank pulled out a letter Bumpy had written, dated June 15th, 1968, 2 weeks before his heart attack. Bumpy must have known he didn't have much time left. The letter was one paragraph written on Bumpy's personal stationery, explaining that Frank Lucas was authorized to represent Bumpy's interests in Southeast Asia. Chenway read the letter twice. Then he nodded. Mr. Johnson spoke very highly of the opportunities this war creates. I will arrange a meeting with my associates in Chiang Mai. Real quick, pause for a second. Are you seeing how Bumpy's final lesson wasn't just go to Asia? It was a complete systematic plan. The contacts, the letter, the blueprint. This is why Bumpy Johnson stayed powerful for 30 years. He thought 10 steps ahead. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that button right now and drop a comment. What would you do if someone handed you a blueprint like this? Would you follow it exactly or make your own changes? Now let's see what Frank did with that blueprint. Frank Lucas returned to New York on August 21st, 1968. He'd spent 3 weeks in Southeast Asia. He'd met producers in the Golden Triangle. He'd negotiated terms. And he'd arranged for his first shipment, 10 kilograms of 98% pure heroin, to be transported to the United States via military cargo planes flying out of Vietnam. This was Bumpy's genius. The Vietnam War meant thousands of military flights every week between Southeast Asia and the United States. Certain people on those flights, certain soldiers, certain officers, could be paid to ensure that particular cargo made it through without inspection. It wasn't a new system, but most people were using it to smuggle small amounts. Frank Lucas was about to use it to smuggle volume. October 14th, 1968. Frank's first shipment arrived. 10 kilograms. Street value if sold at typical purity and prices, $400,000. But Frank didn't do typical. He branded it Blue Magic. He kept it at 98% purity, almost unheard of in Harlem, where heroin was usually cut down to 5% or 10% by the time it reached users. And he sold it for half the price the Italian families were charging. The math was simple. The Italians were buying heroin that had already been cut and marked up multiple times before it reached them. They paid $50,000 per kilo for 30% pure product. Then they cut it further and sold it for $100 per gram. Frank was buying 98% pure heroin for $8,000 per kilo directly from the source. He could sell it at $50 per gram, half their price, and still make 10 times his investment. Within 2 weeks, every heroin user in Harlem was asking for Blue Magic. It was stronger, it was cheaper, and it was suddenly everywhere. The Italian families didn't understand what was happening at first. They thought it was a temporary disruption. Maybe someone had hijacked one of their shipments. But by November 1968, their revenue from Harlem had dropped by 60%. And still, nobody suspected Frank Lucas. Frank followed Bumpy's principles exactly. He didn't try to be the king of Harlem. He didn't hold meetings with other operators. He didn't make a show of power. Instead, he built a completely separate operation. He recruited only family members, his brothers, his cousins, people he could trust it absolutely. He called the organization the Country Boys after their North Carolina roots. He paid them extremely well but demanded total discipline. No flashy cars, no jewelry, no talking about the business. Ever. By 1969, Frank Lucas was importing 50 kilograms per month. By 1970, 100 kilograms. He diversified his routes, military flights from Vietnam, commercial shipping containers through Thailand, even diplomatic pouches through corrupt embassy officials. He expanded beyond Harlem into Brooklyn, the Bronx, and eventually cities across the East Coast. And he stayed invisible. Frank Lucas lived in a modest house in Queens. He drove a regular car. He didn't go to nightclubs or make scenes. When Italian mob bosses had meetings about who's disrupting the heroin market, Frank's name never came up. They were looking for someone flashy, someone making noise, not Bumpy's former driver, living quiet in Queens. By 1971, Frank Lucas was making approximately $1 million per day. Not per week, per day. He owned properties in multiple states. He had $52 million hidden in offshore accounts. He'd bought a mansion in Teaneck, New Jersey, but he didn't show it off. He was, without question, the wealthiest black man in America. Maybe the wealthiest black man in the world. and almost nobody knew his name. That's how good Bumpy's blueprint was. That's how perfect the strategy was. Frank Lucas had done exactly what Bumpy said. He'd gone to the source, eliminated the middleman, undercut the competition, and built something the Italian families couldn't touch. For 3 years, it worked flawlessly. March 8, 1971, Madison Square Garden, New York City. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. The fight of the century. Tickets were selling for $500, huge money in 1971. Front row seats were reserved for the most powerful people in New York. Celebrities, politicians, mob bosses, and Frank Lucas. Frank showed up wearing a full-length chinchilla coat, custom-made, cost $100,000. He sat front row next to his wife, drawing attention from everyone in the arena. Photos were taken. Newspapers ran the pictures the next day. Mystery man in $100,000 coat at Ali Frazier fight. That was the moment Frank Lucas forgot the most important lesson Bumpy Johnson ever taught him. Stay invisible. Within 3 weeks, a federal task force was formed. It was led by Detective Richie Roberts, a cop in the Essex County Prosecutor's Office who'd been investigating heroin trafficking in New Jersey. Roberts saw those photos and asked the same question everyone asked. Who is this guy? 3 months of investigation later, Roberts had his answer. Frank Lucas wasn't Bumpy's former driver. He was the biggest heroin importer on the East Coast. By July 1971, Frank was under full surveillance. By 1973, Roberts had documented Frank's entire operation. The military routes, the country boys network, the distribution system, everything. January 28, 1975. Federal agents raided Frank Lucas's mansion in Teaneck. They found $250,000 cash in the house, but that was nothing compared to what was hidden in offshore accounts and properties. Frank Lucas was arrested on federal drug trafficking charges. He was facing life in prison, multiple life sentences actually. But Frank did something Bumpy Johnson would never have done. He cooperated. Frank became a federal informant. He gave up information on corrupt police officers, DEA agents, and law enforcement officials who'd been on his payroll. His testimony led to the arrest and conviction of 75 people, including more than 50 members of law enforcement. It was one of the largest corruption scandals in New York history. In exchange, Frank's sentence was reduced. He served only 7 years of a 70-year sentence. He was released in 1981, returned to prison briefly in 1984 for an unrelated drug conviction, and was finally released for good in 1991. Frank Lucas lived until 2019. He died at age 88 in Cedar Grove, New Jersey. By the time he died, his story had been turned into movies, books, and documentaries. He'd become famous, which was exactly what Bumpy Johnson told him never to do. So what really changed Harlem forever? Not just Frank's empire. That lasted 7 years before it collapsed. The real change was this. Frank Lucas proved that black operators didn't need Italian suppliers. They could go directly to the source. They could build independent supply chains. They could compete on equal terms. Within 2 years of Frank's arrest, dozens of other operators had copied his model. Direct imports from Southeast Asia, Mexico, and eventually Colombia became standard. The Italian mob's stranglehold on drug distribution was permanently broken, not because someone beat them in a war, but because someone bypassed them entirely. That was Bumpy's vision, and Frank executed it perfectly, for 3 years. But here's the difference between Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas. Bumpy stayed powerful for 30 years because he understood that real power is invisible. Frank became rich by being bold. But bold gets you noticed, and notice gets you caught. Maybe Bumpy knew Frank couldn't resist the spotlight. Maybe he knew that even with the perfect blueprint, Frank would eventually make it about himself instead of about the strategy. Or maybe Bumpy just gave Frank the best gift he could, a chance to be something bigger than Bumpy's driver, and trusted Frank to handle it however he could. What we know for sure is this. In 90 seconds on July 7th, 1968, Bumpy Johnson handed Frank Lucas a blueprint that changed organized crime in America forever. Frank built exactly what Bumpy described. He made more money than any black gangster in history. He proved that the old system could be replaced, but he couldn't maintain the discipline that made Bumpy untouchable for 3 decades. And maybe that's the real lesson. A perfect plan without perfect execution is just a good start. Here's my question for you, and I really want to know your honest answer. If Bumpy Johnson had given you that blueprint, direct access to the source, a complete plan for building an empire, everything you needed, would you have stayed invisible like Bumpy taught? Or would you have bought the chinchilla coat? Would you have been able to resist the spotlight after making $1 million a day? Or would you have wanted the world to know what you'd accomplished? Drop your honest answer in the comments below. No judgment, I just want to know what you really think. And while you're down there, tell me where you're watching this from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. City and country, drop it in the comments. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Hit that button because next week we're revealing what happened to Bumpy Johnson's other lieutenants after his death. Some of them made Frank Lucas look like an amateur. Some of them followed Bumpy's lessons better than Frank ever did. And some of them are still alive today, living quiet, comfortable lives because they understood what Frank forgot. The smartest move is the one nobody sees coming. I'll see you in the next one.